Hello and welcome to Constellations, an online festival on drugs and harm reduction put on by the Harm Reduction International. My name is Ife Tayo Harvey, and I am the founder of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. Today, I'm going to be moderating our discussion on healing justice and psychedelics. I'm really delighted to be here with my very esteemed panel of speakers, Alexis Martin, Camille Barton, Dr. Diana Quinn, Chrissy Hill, and two of our panelists could not join us today, Don Davis and Rebecca Rocha. So we're missing them, but we're still going to have a great discussion. And so before we get into that, I want to acknowledge that I am on Lenape territory, also known as New York City. I also want to acknowledge that, land acknowledgements have become part of a lot of, routines, but they're not enough. In the words of Felisa Sobo and Michael and Valerie Lambert, these statements fail to acknowledge the violent trauma of land being stolen from Indigenous people, the death, the dispossession, and displacement of countless individuals, and much collective suffering. The afterlives of these traumas are deeply felt and experienced in Indigenous communities. So I say that to say that, institutions need to take action and not just pay lip service by saying an acknowledgement. And so before I introduce the panelists, or rather let them introduce themselves, I want to say a bit about healing justice and what that means. Healing justice is a term credited to activist Kara Page, and it means healing justice. It identifies how we can holistically respond to and intervene on generational trauma, violence, and bring collective practices that can impact and transform the consequences of oppression on our bodies, hearts, and minds. So I think of healing justice and psychedelics being tools that do the work of softening our pain and awakening our communities to better possibilities. Now I want to turn to the panelists and let you guys introduce yourselves. And also tell me why healing justice is integral to working with psychedelics. So I want to start with Alexis Martin of the Drug Policy Alliance. Introduce yourself and tell us why healing justice is integral to working with psychedelics.
Hi, thank you so much, Ife. So my name is Alexis Martin. I am development manager at the Drug Policy Alliance, which means that I work in fundraising. Before that, I had a background as a community organizer, and it's really through my work at DPA that I've been able to explore psychedelics both personally and professionally more. And, I don't like to do anything without a justice component in my life. That's something that I'm sort of dedicated to. And more, I'm trying to integrate healing into my own life and into the lives of the people that I'm in community with. And so I think for me, it has been making sure that healing justice and psychedelics go hand in hand personally has been a sort of grounding tool to make sure that I'm always checking in with myself as I'm using them, as I'm in community with folks who are using them, and as I'm honoring the roots and the lineages from where we get this, where we've gotten our knowledge.
Yes, thank you, Alexis. I want to go to Camille next.
Thanks, Ife. I'm really happy to be here with you all. So I'm Camille. I'm an artist, renegade researcher working on the intersections of embodiment, drug policy, and healing justice. I do various things, but at the moment, most of my time is spent running a master's program called Ecologies of Transformation, which is researching how art making and embodiment can create social change. Healing justice in the context of psychedelics is very important to me because, as I'm sure many of us would agree on the panel, sacred earth medicines have an incredible potential for transformation. But if we don't tend to the context and the ways in which we're holding this medicine and the lineages and, you know, the way we need to really tend to reciprocity, then I doubt that the transformative potential can be as great. So this is why in this moment in particular, as we see the commodification of the psychedelic space, I think it's very important that we consider what actions will really sustain life for the next 7 generations to come, and how we can be in right relationship with the Indigenous communities that have really held this sacred knowledge for such a long time, and also how we rebuild and repair harms done to those who have been targeted by the war on drugs. So that's why it feels relevant for me. I'm really glad to be here with you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Next, I want to go to Diana.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Diana Quinn. I'm based in Waiwiatanam, also known as Detroit, Michigan, on Anishinaabe territory, living and working as a guest in these lands in reciprocity and relationship with the First Peoples. I am a naturopathic doctor and have been practiced within different modalities of integrated mental health and somatics. I'm also a healing justice practitioner and member of Healing by Choice, which is a women of color and gender nonconforming group of healing practitioners based here in Detroit, and co-founder of the Psychedelic Liberation Collective, which is a group of healing practitioners that hold space for anti-racism education and discussion within psychedelic integration context, as well as healing justice spaces for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people of the global majority, and their identified individuals. So we focus on community care, and healing justice is really kind of the foundation of the work that I do and have done for many years in those capacities. I'm also currently a trainee of the California Institute of Integral Studies Psychedelic Assisted Therapies and Research Program, and participating in a lot of dialogue about really bringing increasing sort of consciousness and awareness of issues of equity, reciprocity, and healing justice into psychedelic spaces in the community at large. So I think, you know, just to continue on with some of the things that have already been stated about why this is important, I definitely think that not only will the absence of these frameworks, healing justice is a framework that has its roots, as Ikatayo mentioned, Kara Page, you know, being kind of an integral person in that lineage, which I, you know, am really humbled and honored to have, you know, kind of come out of. And other participants in the 2010 U.S. Social Forum here in Detroit, the work of Susan Raffo, Anjali Taneja, Shira Hassan, Autumn Brown, and many others who have really laid an organizational framework to really be applied to any context, right? Where we're bringing healing work into movement, and we're bringing awareness of social justice into healing spaces. So I think not only will a lack of that framework diminish the therapeutic potential of these medicines, but also very much stands the risk of continuing to produce harm, the colonial and racial harm that we've seen from unjust systems. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Diana. Next, I'm going to go to Chrissy.
Yeah, no, Ife, happy to be here. I'm Chrissy Hill. I'm part of the Haudenosaunee people, the Tuscarora, located over here near Hudson, New York, which would have been the traditional lands of the Mohicans, Mohawks as well. And I have a home over in the western door of the space known as New York, near Niagara Falls. And that is our what we call our nation right now. And I am living over here on the Eastern Door. I spent the last 25 years or so working, living on our nation, doing things that I guess now people know as Indigenous peacekeeping. Didn't really know that was a thing until I wasn't in that space anymore, and really working towards supporting our next generation's reacquisition of the language and traditions and ceremonies. I have 4 adult kids and I have 6 grandkids. They're all under the age of 11, so that's super exciting. And a couple of them are actually speaking Tuscarora. One of them speaks Tuscarora and Mohawk also. And so to hear that language on the ancestral lands of my grandmother, who was at a boarding school known as Carlisle Industrial School, located in eastern Pennsylvania, I can't imagine what the land feels like, just knowing and hearing the language of the past, even though that wasn't our specific ancestral homeland. I'm not exactly sure where that is, but to answer the question about the healing justice is, particularly around psychedelics, psychoactives, plant medicine, that kind of thing. None of those words would have been words that we used. They were a way of life and a way of being, and using all of nature together, not just in ceremony, but in every day. We have that responsibility to that plant, that bird, that tree, the land that we're on, responsibly. We need to be in right relationship with it. And so, the Tuscarora people had moved from the place known as New York, went down to the place known as North Carolina, and we became known as people of the hemp. And then we moved back up north to our lands, and we lost a lot of that access to the plant spirits and to those memories that others still may be able to transmit to us. So I'd really like to be in the healing space more so than the trauma space. We've been there long enough, and it's okay to move through it. But bringing this perspective of right relationship in many different types of ways, and then recognizing that this conversation in this space is really hard to be in. We didn't ask for some of this, and now we're being asked to participate in it. And there's not as much talk about healing as one would like to think in these spaces. So I'm really happy to be here, and like to pass it back to you, Ife.
Thank you so much. Rebecca, I'm going to come to you now. We're doing introductions, and just say a little bit about why healing justice is integral to working with psychedelics.
So thank you for the invitation. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Rebecca Rocha. I am from Brazil, the land of Tupi-Guarani and other indigenous people. I'm currently living in the land of Multnomah, Clackamas, Molalla, and other indigenous people, also known as Portland in Oregon, US. I am a psychotherapist. I am a LCSW. My work is focused on trauma, culturally sensitive services, and also social justice oriented. I work with a lot of people from different ethnic backgrounds. I also have a PhD in clinical psychology and culture. And my PhD was in Brazil, and I studied the relationship between ayahuasca and patterns of substance use. Talking about healing justice, I thought that that's a very interesting and important uh, idea for work with psychedelics because of the history of injustice. And as some of you mentioned, the potential of healing that plant medicine can have. And I feel that one cannot exist without the other. Uh, Healing without justice, in my opinion, is harmful, and justice is without healing is unjust, especially for the people that have been silenced, not acknowledged, having their wisdom not acknowledged, minimized, especially when we talk about plant medicine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to acknowledge that our colleague Dawn Davis wasn't able to join us today, unfortunately. So we're going to miss her. But let's go ahead and get into some of the questions. Thank you all for your answers. I'm really excited to dig into everything and a lot of the things that you guys mentioned in your introduction. I want to come to Alexis first. Alexis, you last year you penned a piece called "Pleasure Delayed." This Juneteenth should include freedom to use drugs. So, can you say a little bit about how substances like psychedelics can be pleasurable, and why is pleasure healing or a part of healing justice?
For sure. So I think it's important to talk a little bit about the context of when I wrote that. So it was June 2020, and I don't want to put us all back there, but you can maybe bring up some of the feelings that you were feeling at that time. And I had been and was still healing from my own battle with COVID, which I'd gotten as soon as the pandemic started, essentially in New York. So the third week of March, as everything was closing down, my lungs were as well. And so I was sort of healing from that as there was this powerful vocal movement, which was not new, was a new phase of something I'd been a part of and been feeling the impacts emotionally of a long time. And so even as I wrote this, I was not able to be involved in the protest because of the physical limitations I had at the time. And, you know, there was news coming out about how George Floyd himself had COVID, and there were all of these things, right, that were intrinsically linked together. And Juneteenth was approaching, and suddenly Juneteenth was a thing that people outside of the Black community were talking about, were apparently getting the day off of. You know, like it was a whole new, and now we know in some ways even more unfulfilled than previous times where there were these huge proclamations, and a year later, a year and a half later, we know that predictably so little of that was fulfilled. And so it was in this context that I was thinking more about, you know, this has been something a lot of us had talked about, the Black folks that I was in community with, about how we not move from a harm reduction sphere. I would never want to move from that, but how we expand a harm reduction sphere and think a little bit outside of drugs and harm, and think about how Black people can claim, because there's no real reclaiming, drugs and pleasure, right? And how we can create space where people can feel comfortable engaging in play and pleasure as it relates to drugs and feel safe to do that, right? Because there are multiple different reasons why that isn't possible. I'm lucky enough to come from the organizing background that I came from, which was BYP 100, which is an organization, a Black queer feminist organization that works in the US, across the US mainly. And play and song and joy and dance was always a big part of our formulation. And it was one of the things that we really wanted to always center. And so I was so lucky to come from that space and to know that that is one way to sort of build yourself up as you're doing this work that can kind of tear you down. But even in those spaces, drug use can be sort of either stigmatized or feared. And so it was really about thinking, what do we need to make a space where Black people can enjoy themselves and have pleasure? You know, as we're talking about healing, so much of healing is painful, right? It's like the hard work of whether it's emotional or physical, like it does not usually feel good, right? And there has to be room for some healing that feels good, that just feels good. And for me, in particular, shrooms has provided that space. Ife and I went on a wonderful retreat in New Mexico, which sort of introduced this to me a few years ago, which was all women of color. You know, using mushrooms grown by a Black woman who held my hand as I did them. And without that space, I never would have been able to really fully find that pleasure center and like grow it and care for it through the pandemic, which I very much needed, as we all did. Yeah, and so that was some of what was coming up for me as I was writing the piece. And I'm excited to continue that conversation past the piece and hear how other folks incorporate that pleasure into their own lives.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to just leave a little bit of space in case other folks wanted to respond to that. Okay. Thank you for that, Alexis. Yeah, I think, you know, what was interesting, I know you got a lot of strong reactions from your piece of, you know, folks saying like, oh, like, what is this about? Drug use and pleasure? Like, oh, you know.
Yeah.
I think, you know, we kind of live in a culture where like focusing on pleasure and prioritizing that is kind of like seen as like weird or like silly.
I mean, even the word pleasure, it almost feels transgressive to say it out loud in public. It's like, what are you talking about? But yeah, you know, I think there's been more and more work about centering pleasure and rest. And I think those two things go, and healing, and they all go kind of hand in hand. And you need sort of each piece of that.
Yeah, that kind of helps me pivot to another question that I have for Rebecca. Is, you know, you are a therapist, right? And you also, you know, have a background in the cultural aspect of psychedelics. So I wanted to ask you, you know, what are the roles that you play in the psychedelic world, and how do you see healing both in the therapist's office and outside of the therapist's office?
Yes, and I actually want to comment something about something that Alexis was talking. When I see healing, I see the pleasure too. I see the pain, but I also see the pleasure. I feel that going back to difficult times of our lives and even healing would not be possible without pleasure. And I think that's the potential of plant medicine, right? That can bring that, so we are able to face some difficult parts of ourselves, some difficult parts of our lives, because it's just sometimes can be unbearable without that balance. Just to comment on Alexa's, responses, um, and talking about your question, Ify, more specifically. Um, I do have a training. I received the MAPS MDMA training, the first, the first, the like theoretical part of the training to offer MDMA assisted psychotherapy. However, I don't have clinical experience with psychedelic therapy. My experience has been more focusing ritualistic use, spiritual use, and now I am involved in some policy and like programming work. And I feel that that's also aligned with my values about plant medicine and like my community values. Um, Not that I don't want to be able to use clinically, but so far that's been my experience more in the community, more community work and spiritual work. My my PhD was focused on spiritual and ritualistic use and how um, how some people with a history of substance use change their pattern of use throughout the years. Just their relationship with substances changed. And now I am working in an effort like called Plant Medicine Healing Alliance, uh, that's focused on, because here in Oregon, we had two measures that were passed last year. One of them is to decriminalize uh, substance users, but that didn't include like people with maybe the people that had like amount of substance, like maybe for group healing, that would be excluded. So this measure is focused on a local resolution to address that, to include people with maybe an amount of plant medicine or a psychedelic substance that could be used maybe for a group or a community setting. Um, and another policy work that I am involved is I am serving in the equity subcommittee for the Measure 109 that's developing the program that will allow Oregonians to have like to use mushrooms therapeutically. And my focus has been really to include people with disabilities, to include people with major mental illness, because that's been my work. My work as a social worker has been very focused on people from more marginalized backgrounds and people of color, immigrants. So I try to advocate uh, for my communities and also the communities that I serve. And I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what I've been doing. I have now been doing a lot of individual work with psychedelics and plant medicines.
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, you're doing a ton of work, and it sounds like it's really kind of 360 in a way that, you're also advocating on the policy side while also doing like healing work not necessarily psychedelics, but just working as a therapist, right? And so I feel like you're kind of embodying what healing justice is. Doing that advocacy work, advocating for marginalized folks, and also doing the healing work on top of that. So there's a lot there. I'm going to come back to you with another question, but I wanted to come next to Diana and Camille, because we're on the topic of pleasure and things that feel good, and y'all's background is y'all know a lot about death, right, and grief and loss, and so I want to talk about some of the work that you guys do with death and psychedelics, and why that is important, and also how that connects to healing justice, and how do we hold collective grief? We're in this moment where we have had such a major loss around the world due to COVID, and like all the collateral damage with COVID. So how do we hold the collective grief that we're all experiencing?
I can maybe jump in first, but I'd love to hear from you, Deanna. Yeah, I think that grief is sort of often the elephant in the room, particularly now in this time. There's just so much of it that's not processed. And even with what you were sharing before, Alexis, about pleasure being taboo, I think it's similar to with grief, that grief and pleasure, certain mental health experiences, anything that's not really productive is not very welcome under capitalism. It's sort of like, let's not really talk about it too much. But it feels, particularly loud right now, in this moment of collective grieving, of so much death, so much changing, and really feeling, at least to me, like we're rubbing up against so many legacies of ongoing trauma, ongoing oppression that are feeling quite palpable and visible in a way that maybe they haven't been on this level for a while. I sort of don't have an easy answer for it, to be honest, but I think, at least in my personal life and kind of on a community level, I think it's about practice, like really having to actually learn to incorporate regular moments for grief, for being with loss, and developing tools to sit with it. Because, a lot of cultural approaches have been erased or lost with colonization. And so I think there's a kind of needing to sort of remember and go back to what traditions maybe we have connection with, and if not, then use ritual contexts that aren't necessarily specific to communities to kind of rebuild and create containers where we can do grief work with each other. I think about a lot of traditions that are still intact in the West African context, for example, where there's professional wailers who will go to funeral rites, and ways that kind of embodied mourning is still quite present, despite the various attempts to kind of eradicate many of these practices. And on a personal level, the last sort of 18 months, I've been doing some research sort of looking at embodied grief practices and putting together a toolkit of different rituals. And I'm in the final days of kind of wrapping it up, and I hope it will be out in the world next week. It's just like this final push to try and get it out there. But yeah, I think practice is really key, even though there can be a lot of resistance, even in myself, as much as I know this is something that's going to really help me, especially if I notice tendrils of depression coming up. I'm now realizing, there's some grief that I'm shoving over here when actually it needs to move through. The one last thing I'll say, and I'd love to hear from Deanna on this, is I do hope it's something we can talk more about in the drug policy and harm reduction space more broadly, because I think there's lots of conversations about, and quite rightly, about drug user rights, and I think that's incredibly important. But what we don't often speak about is, what could we also shift in our society so that so many of us don't feel like we have to numb in order to just be and to exist, or we wouldn't, or not have to use copious amounts of plant medicines to heal enough to just exist. And so I think there's some also deeper structural questions we could ask ourselves about, how to sit with these things in the movement and not just deal with certain things which are important but can feel quite surface to me.
Yeah. Yeah, you said a lot of good stuff. I'm gonna let Diana respond and try to hold on to everything you just said for a second.
Yeah, I as well, want to just, sit with some of that, because agreed, you said a lot of good stuff. Really resonate with and relate to much of that. And there are a few capacities in which the work that I do holds space for grief and loss and death, where it's needed, kind of within communities and in community spaces, creating healing justice spaces for communities experiencing grief. This is part of the work that I do with Healing by Choice, and have done as well with a fellow end-of-life doula colleague of mine, Oceana Sawyer. And those are really ritualized community care spaces. And there are many, practitioners that are offering spaces like this that are, BIPOC centered, either, kind of like Camille, spoke to, drawing on the traditions that the facilitator is bringing, to, kind of create ceremonial ritualized space, or using, somatic and embodied practices that really help our systems just move through and be with those big experiences that come up around grief and loss, those the full range of emotions that are present with us. And I think, as Camille really, kind of astutely pointed to, culturally, and I think that this is a Western phenomenon, it's really, pretty widespread, that the inability, absolutely capitalism plays a role in productivity, but I see this as being kind of connected to, 500 plus years of colonial legacy, wherein any experience, any human, kind of experience that we feel that, there needs to be sort of this illusion of control over, whether it's the mysteries of life and death, or of expanded states of consciousness, or deep grief, or even, profound pleasure and joy. These are things that the white supremacist colonial framework, does not have a capacity for, and so the historical, kind of foundation for where we're at right now is just, widespread suppression of any of those experiences, medicalization of death and of birth, right? And now we're even seeing this medicalization of psychedelics, and this very individualized container where the client is lying on a couch with eye shades, and, and it's not to say that some people aren't experiencing deep healing with that, but I just really want to, kind of pull back the veil on, what's happening below the surface with that. So, I mean, I really think that those questions are of interest to me, kind of within the psychedelic world at large, and also just with how we move, kind of in our spaces, how we are increasing our own capacities to be with suffering, to be with uncomfortable feelings, to be with the discomfort that arises when we're confronting and naming racism and white supremacy, or we're naming extractivist colonial practices, or we're naming therapy abuse, or, whatever it is, in the therapeutic space. And I know that, as a somatic practitioner myself, I know we have a long way to go. And some of us, kind of have some reps under our belt, as Resma Menakem, would say. And some of us are really just coming to this. And I really think this is like the core of healing justice in general, that we need movements that center the most marginalized, because because Black, Indigenous, people of the global majority, people of color, queer folks, trans folks, disabled folks, we have been holding these, experiences of, dual awareness, of really kind of being with, kind of a lot of these experiences of generational trauma and, kind of historical trauma and all of the, kind of structural oppression, right? And I don't want a DEI committee. I want us, actually in leadership, because I don't think that this movement is really going to, kind of actually succeed at bringing about the kind of widespread, therapeutic benefit on a large scale, and do less harm unless that happens.
Thank you both so much. It's so rich. I wanted to give some space to the other panelists if any of you guys wanted to respond before I jump in. Okay, well, y'all just touched on so many good points. Camille, I wanted to come back to your point about, how in the drug policy and harm reduction space, how there is so much grief, right? But we don't always acknowledge that in a way that's like, this is painful, right? Like acknowledging that pain. And, because I think, we lost 91,000 people to overdose this just last year alone, right? It's one of the leading causes of deaths for adults under the age of 50, I believe. And these are our colleagues, these are our community members, these are our neighbors, right? And why aren't we holding more space for that, right? I think it's partly because so many of us are policy wonks, and we kind of shy away from that, that practice of grieving, and I think part of what colonialism did to us was kind of divorce our minds from our bodies in a way, kind of like how trauma does, right? Mm-hmm. And kind of telling us not to trust, what we feel in our body. And Diana, I love that you touched on the medicalization part of it, because we have so much individualism in the US. I don't even think we realize when we're doing it, right? Like when we create these modalities, I don't think people realize that, a lot of this healing is just about being in community with each other and sharing space and learning how to do that, right? Because like you said, it's a practice, and we have to practice being in community with each other, to learn how to get it right. And Diana, I was also thinking about, the panels that we did earlier this year and last year, and how we kind of uncovered the fact that a lot of our grief and a lot of the loss that we're experiencing is political, right? Like the practices that were taken away from us, the fact that 91,000 people can die from a drug overdose, and we have the solutions right in front of us, and our government refuses to employ that, right? Like that, all of those things are very much political, and it becomes compounded over time, right? Like Alexis, what you were saying about Juneteenth and the protests, I think that those protests were a result of so many people's compounded grief, right? Tired of seeing, Black and Indigenous people being killed by cops or, white supremacists. So yeah, I just want to thank you guys for raising those points, because they're all super, super important.
And if I could just quickly, sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Just quickly adding that in the wake of that grief, it can feel kind of trivial to prioritize pleasure. Particularly, I'm sure a lot of the attendees of this conference, as well as the people on this panel, have integrated this work into their personal and professional lives. And so as you're recovering from grief or feeling your own, it can feel kind of ridiculous to take time out and to you know, really cultivate pleasure in your own life. And it's not. It's absolutely not. It's integral to both your personal life, but also the integrity of the work that we're doing.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. I think that, you know, this colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism, all that stuff makes us kind of feel like healing, rest, all those things, grieving are trivial, and we need to just be workhorses, you know. And I wanted to pivot a little bit because we were talking about some of the practices that were taken away from us, right? Especially around grieving, and I think that's super interesting. I was reading an article a few months ago about in coastal Carolinas, where I'm from, Charleston, there were practices, grieving practices, such as like passing a baby over a casket. And that's about making sure that the spirit of the person doesn't come back through the baby. And so that was a really interesting practice that has kind of died off, that I learned about in my area where I'm from. Chrissy, I wanted to come to you and talk about some of the indigenous practices around medicine and healing, and you know, can you talk about some of the traditions within your own people, and what they are, and how they're seen today, and how they have shifted over time?
Yeah, definitely. I'm getting some feedback. Let me see. Is that any better? All right, great. Yeah, it's interesting that you're talking about policies, and you know, I'd like to walk us back to I could go really far back, but we'll start with 1924 in the United States with the Citizens Act of the United States, that all Indigenous people within the United States got to be citizens without requesting it. And that happened without a lot of knowledge. It didn't really, maybe one or two Indigenous people might have said, "Hey, yeah, sure, you're gonna provide land for me, whatever." You know, the way these conversations go, and you know, and to that point, that was the removal of sovereignty. And that also allowed the United States government to do a whole bunch of other things, including land removal, up until like the 1950s or 60s. Also the Religious Freedom Act, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, which then allowed people to do their ceremonies and possess their sacred items and have access to spaces that had been previously removed, on the basis that Indigenous people were citizens based on this 1924 conversation. And so, you know, in the meantime, we're persisting and to talk to what everybody else has been saying about grief and about pleasure. You know, the way of persistence is finding ways to have both and that we can have pleasure amidst chronic disaster of whatever we choose to name. And I think that is part of my healing journey. More generally is to realize this is not a binary and or dichotomy. It's a both and. So if I'm feeling grief, which I generally feel in September when kids go back to school, it's a generational thing. My great grandmother was in residential school twice, as was my grandmother. And my children's paternal grandmother was at a horrific place called the Mush Hole, the Mohawk Institute in Ontario, Canada. And so I don't feel excitement when people are getting haircuts and getting new clothes. That signifies sadness for me. And so finding pleasure in those moments can be difficult. And so over the course of time, I've just learned to say, okay, I'm going to feel sad at this time, and allow myself to settle into that grief, and also not deny myself of this imposed lack of pleasure, because that was a time we like I said, we didn't ask for this, but yet we have to find ways to persist. So to get more directly back to Ife's question, and something I mentioned earlier is that we are people of the hemp, and through time we've been Christianized. We've had the New York State Power Authority took over half of our land that was gifted to us, shared with us, to provide power towards the eastern seaboard on the basis of fact that, that you don't need all this space to fish and farm. And so we've lost a lot. And it's interesting because I now find myself in space with people that do have a great relationship with hemp, and not necessarily for commercial reasons only, but because of the value of this plant and the plant spirit that's they're engaging with, and recognizing it's not just about recreational and using it purely for the psychedelics, but it's for that right relationship with the earth and the water that also came apart to be a part of the plant along with the rest of the celestial bodies, and really wanting to know what some of these rituals are. I can look back in some of the history books, and maybe Ife, we can share that particular link that I shared in our pre-session of, I can't remember the name of it offhand, but some of the traditions, there's so many Indigenous people in North America that have lost so many things. And, this is where we're feeling that little bit of, I really wish Dawn was here at this moment to share her journey with peyote and what's going on with that. But this is one of these questions. I don't know how much we've lost, and I don't know how we're going to get it back. And to sit together in these spaces actually gives a lot of ideas of how we can continue these conversations, and figure out how we can transmit these through our ancestral memories, sitting around fire and just having conversations about what it means to have these losses of things we don't even know. Mm-hmm. So, but there are ways, smudging, tobacco, sitting in the longhouse ceremonies, sweats, those kinds of things that people have been able to hold on to, because that ceremony is really to bring back this, what I think you were talking about, Ife, being severed. Our mind and body from our spirits, and ceremony and ritual is about remembering those things. And so being able to sit with those things, however it looks for us, we can figure out where our traditions are disrupted and what's missing, and coming back together and sharing those things is really a big part of it. So, speaking personally, my son went through quite the journey of, he was in church for a while at the behest of my mother. Then he found Buddhism when he went to college. And now he is one of our speakers in our community that can do ceremonies. We don't have to go to another community and say, hey, we need help. He can do that for him. We can do that for ourselves. And so those are things that sometimes we have to go hang out with someone else to find out the things we don't know. So, I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that, Ife. I know it's kind of a wandering answer to your question.
No, that was a great answer. I wanted to open it up to other panelists to see if they had any thoughts to add or responses to that. Yeah, when you said the part about not realizing how much we've lost, like that just hit me like, whoa, like it's almost overwhelming in a way, right? Just realizing how much we've lost and like that level of grief that we're all holding, and how, you know, white supremacy tells us that like, oh yeah, just get over it, you know, like the violence in statements like that, just get over it, you know. And it also, you know, when you were talking about, you know, some of the practices, I was just thinking about how, you know, in a lot of the conversations we're having in the psychedelic space, you know, and in light of everything that happened last year with the uprisings, I'm seeing a lot of people pay lip service to issues regarding Black folks, regarding Indigenous folks, right? And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Like, how do we get beyond that? You know, what does it mean when we say we're going to center Indigenous folks, we're going to center Black folks, we're going to center people of color, right? Because it's easy to just say that, right? It's easy to say like, oh, we're inclusive, or oh, we're doing this, we're doing that, right? But what does that actually mean, and how does it look, and how do we get there? And I know that's a huge question, right? But I was speaking on a panel last night around cannabis equity, and like the cannabis equity social programs that come with legalization, and how a lot of people want to rush that process of equity, right? And it's not a process to be rushed, because I mean, look at what we're dealing with, right? So what does that process look like for psychedelics in y'all's mind? And this is a question for everyone on the panel. What does it really mean to center Indigenous people? What does it really mean to give equity? Like, yeah, I think that this is something that Dawn could speak to. So I'm sad that she's not here, right? But I find that a lot of times when you say these things, folks get so uncomfortable, right? And I think that's really telling. So I want to hear y'all's thoughts.
I'm happy to jump in first, if that's okay.
Yeah, me too. I'll if I can go next, that would be
Chrissy,
great.
why don't you go first, and then I'll share.
Oh, okay. Yeah, speaking, it's so hard because oftentimes I just want to be left alone and let my family heal and figure out our ways. But as I said, we don't know what we need, and we often don't have the resources to go do that. In terms of like mental health, I get very I don't always do so well in dyads. I need that collectiveness, and for me, some of that could look like the way forward of centering people is those people with retreat centers offer space for families to come and have the choice. Do you want to feed yourself or not? Because so many wonderful conversations happen in the kitchen and around the activities of that commonality. I think one of the things that doesn't look like is asking people of color and global majorities and marginalized identities to be on your board unless you can figure out how to compensate for time. And emotional labor. I have something in my head called the equity multiplier. So that if I sit in a space and it's a heavy emotional burden for me, I kind of like triple the amount of time that it actually takes, because I need time to prepare myself before I engage. I have to be able to figure out what happens if there are some triggers that happen in the space, how I deal with it in the moment, and then I have to take care of myself afterwards. And so, oftentimes it's like, oh, look at us, we have this board, and there's so much DEI stuff going, and it's like, yeah, no, you're doing that for you. You're not doing that for me. So looking at things like that, but really it's providing, figuring out ways where BIPOC folk and marginalized identities can sit and figure out what they can do best for themselves, because we do know what we need oftentimes, and we do know that there's resources we can't reach. We can't go sit for 2 weeks in a retreat center. We can't pay for it, and nor can we afford to miss work. So thinking about it that way, we can also sit together in these spaces with many different people that have their own journeys, because Ife, you mentioned that sense of disembodiment. Diane, I believe you've mentioned that too, being in the somatic world, that disconnection, and how we can't do it by ourselves. Sometimes we actually need other people to say, hey, let me help you pick this up and engage. And it is collective. It's taking all this individual information that we gather, bringing it together, and now we're sharing knowledge. And then as we go on throughout the times when we're not together, sharing what we've learned and what we know, and asking questions becomes that collective wisdom that all helps us, because those with European descent have been severed from their homelands, and they don't know their people and the ways that those particular notions of indigenous knowledge has been lost as well. And we all have a little bit to share with each other. So, I think being really mindful of the emotional labor and what that means to ask, how can I center you without centering myself? I think that's actually the bigger question. So I will go mute and offer it up to Diana or Ife.
Thank you. That was, completely, Chrissy. I just, I think, sort of as that piece, that you were lifting up about the emotional labor of being in a space that is a predominantly white space with a, very Western, kind of hegemony and ideology orientation is high. And I really think that invitations to, sit on boards, in an unpaid capacity, or, kind of serve on committees, I really sincerely mean it when I think that what really needs to happen for equity, as you were speaking to, Ife, is actually that we're going to have to sit with, like you said, the discomfort that, it's going to have to be a relinquishing of, power and control, and like the central positions of leadership, and having, kind of marginalized folks like sit in those positions as in a paid capacity. I really believe that that's going to be necessary. And the one other thing that I wanted to speak to, since Dawn isn't here, and I'm so, sorry about that, and can't, speak on issues of peyote to the, anywhere near, the depth that she can. But as a third generation Mexican American who has done a lot of work to heal the interrupted Indigenous lineage of my own from that region, and connecting with peyote cultures of Mexico, I have heard, repeatedly the importance, right, of, and it's not just around peyote, because I've heard the same thing from directly, platformed Indigenous speakers from the Amazon, talking about ayahuasca, which is similarly threatened, its habitat is threatened, that there's a call to, divest from, the taking of those medicines, right? That decriminalization as the pathway that's currently on the table, right? I mean, that's what's up right now. And as people who are, interested in ending the war on drugs and, kind of interrupting the racial harm to Black and Brown people, and really the global impact of the war on drugs, right? I think we can agree that we want to take action on that. However, initiatives that participate with a divide and conquer ideology, where Black Indigenous people are on opposite sides of an issue, are not going to work. And we need to I really deeply believe, listen to what Indigenous people are saying about how to move forward, kind of in relationship with the medicines that they have been in relationship with for thousands of years, and sometimes those are going to be things that people in this movement are not going to want to do. And I mean, I think that that's the hard truth.
Yeah. Yep. It is 100% is the hard truth. And like I said earlier, it's not easy work, and folks want it to be easy work, and folks want it to be that quick, instant gratification, and it's not that, right? We're doing really deep, heavy work, and that takes time, and we can only work at the speed of trust.
Right. I mean, yeah, if I can jump in quickly, I mean, I think one thing that I think a lot about is relationship building, and really building strength and trust across power can be incredibly difficult, particularly when you are not benefited by the power structures, right? And so when we're talking about centering, and there's a sort of unsaid pronoun of who's doing the centering, and I think I can't, if it was Chrissy or Diana who said you have to give something up, and there are going to be people who have to give something up, and that'll look a lot of different ways. As I mentioned at the beginning, I work in fundraising, so I think about this a lot. I think a lot about the power structure of philanthropy, and have been watching it grow and grow, particularly in the psychedelics movement. And yeah, I mean, it's like you said, it is not a quick answer. There's no quick answer, right? That's why there are all these DEI committees that pop up every 5 seconds. That's why we all have submitted to doing work, emotional labor that we don't want to do, because we're just trying to chip away at it, and then end up chipping away at ourselves. But yeah, it is the hard work of really being in community with people and allowing yourself to be challenged by others, particularly if you're coming from a place of a privileged identity, in any way, race, class, gender.
I'd love to also jump in a little bit. Thank you for sharing, Alexis and Chrissy and Deanna. Yeah, I think that was something you shared, Chrissy, about European heritage people who are kind of very disconnected from their former Indigenous roots. And I think this is something I would love to see more work on. I know there are some groups doing this, like I really like White Awake. They have a Dharma-based approach to kind of working with white folks around anti-racism, but really trying to move, I guess, beyond this saviorism position, which I think in a way ties to this conversation of centering. And as you said, Alexis, who's doing the centering? In a way we see is these big organizations or people that are like, right, as a good white person, I'm going to go and now switch the focus. But I kind of would love there to be this work around them not doing it to feel good or feel like they're a good person, but also doing it for themselves, like for their ancestors, for actually understanding the severing that happened for their lines too, and seeing themselves as part of this relationship rather than just in this power position that's going to be usurped, but actually like a different leveling, because then it becomes a very, it takes a different shape then, that I find more interesting. And one in which I think also kind of implicates or complicates the ways that we frame this as well around sometimes assuming that all BIPOC people or all global majority people are going to actually bring about the change that we want. And unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. So I think it's a bit of a prickly one to talk about, but I think we really need to dig in to think about, what are the dynamics and legacies of colonialism that live amongst us in many of our bodies, right? And what does it look like to build different kinds of relationships and really to practice different ways of being and measure that and experiment and kind of say, we're going to try this for a while, and then we might have to pause and reflect and pivot and go a different direction. Because I think for a lot of us, we're like, how do we do this? We know what we don't want, but maybe we're still trying to work out how we get somewhere else. But I definitely agree that the kind of positioning around DEI and all these initiatives that are supposed to just change everything from this kind of saviorism perspective just don't feel like they're working. And I wonder what it would look like to really sit with how these dynamics of colonization are within in our own bodies, and how we could build movements that were looking at this kind of connection from the self to the community and the wider world as a kind of spiraling out, rather than this slight shifting of power dynamics that actually doesn't really seem to be that long lasting.
Thank you. Rebecca.
Yes, I've been wanting to talk about this too. And maybe I can just add, I know some people shared a lot of things that I agree with, so I can just add a few points. What came to my mind is like how we are choosing our political leaders, because that's what I saw here in Oregon with the Measure 109. Was a lot of bias in the appointment of the board. Very focused on medical model. Very few people from Black, brown, indigenous backgrounds. So I think that's one important point. Like, who are we voting for? It is a thing to consider. And another thing that came to my mind that's also related to some points that Camille brought, and I think Diana brought, it's the moral trauma associated with colonialism. It's a very hard work, so it's so much easier to give the burden to BIPOC, people of color, to do this work. And sometimes we are even doing that by taking parts in those boards. And also, like, another thought that I had was our own bias. I felt that sometimes I make some decisions because I do have some privileges. I do hold some privileged identities, myself, which might not be true maybe with people when I compare myself with people from my ethnic group that might not have my privileges. So also our own bias. So those are my three thoughts, like being aware of our own bias. I also can navigate very well these two words, right? My community and the white word. How are we choosing our political leaders? And also, like, what we doing when we take part of those boards? Are we supporting this system or? So those are my thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's kind of baffling sometimes how, we in the psychedelics world, a lot of us claim to like want to change things for the better, and then we end up kind of replicating the same or upholding the same structures as the status quo, right? And I think, Rebecca, you're talking about the advisory board, mostly being white and mostly being folks with MDs, right? And it kind of speaks to what Diana was saying about medicalization and how we uphold that over indigenous knowledge and wisdom. So thank you guys so much. Those are all amazing answers. And it got me thinking about a lot, but we also have a few questions in the chat that I want to get to. A lot of awesome questions. I want to come to Suchitra's question. How can we incorporate an understanding of the global North-South divide and the fact that much of the reform happening in psychedelics is happening in countries that have been colonizers or are imperialist powers like the US when we advocate for progressive drug laws? It's a great question. I think, we as folks in, I think most of us are in the US, not all of us, but we have to realize, and we also have to reckon with the fact that the punitive drug policies that we have here in the States were also exported to many other countries and used as a way to kind of destabilize their governments, their communities. So we need to talk about that. But I want to hear from you guys. How do we incorporate that understanding, especially, when we're talking about things like ayahuasca, right? People in South America, how do we reckon with the fact that like our drug war has been connected to, things going on in Colombia, in Brazil, and Central America as well?
I might jump in. Thank you for the question. When I was reading it, what came to mind was this really brilliant book I'm still working my way through called World Making After Empire by Adam Getachew, who's Ethiopian American. And in this book, she's kind of tracing a lot of the kind of independence thinkers like Kwame Nkrumah and people who were really involved in kind of that sort of first wave of decolonization, mostly from the British Empire, not exclusively, but the British have a lot to answer for. And what I find really fascinating about the book, and I compare it to our politics now of thinking about decolonization and the way it's used, such a buzzword right now, she's really tracing that for these thinkers and people involved in the movement, national self-determination was not the end goal. It was like one facet, and actually international solidarity and naming and addressing the kind of global racist hierarchy that relates and kind of sustains the global North-South divide was the on the agenda for them. It was about how do we actually subvert this global division. And so I find it interesting now. I don't believe in linear progress anyway, but this idea we sometimes think, oh, our ideas are so much more advanced or our politics are so much more advanced now. And actually, in some ways, we could see it as a regression because we're using this language and have actually forgotten a lot of the political maneuvers, the international building and solidarity work that was happening not so long ago. And I really hope that we can remember that and revive that, because I think it is slightly navel-gazy. Especially, I'll speak for myself, someone that has recently severed Indigenous lineage in the African context, but grew up in the UK. There's a lot of talking about the inequality that Black British or Black migrant diaspora people experience, and that's very real. But also, I have huge amounts of power compared to my relatives that live in Nigeria. How can I use that power and also express and talk about and work to also build the liberation of people I grew up and around, but to see that as connected rather than this kind of navel-gazing national fermenting that's happening, but really think about the geopolitics and the relationships that we're entrenched in, and as Christy was saying as well, like breaking out of the binaries, really seeing that we're not just in a victim role or an oppressor role, we're often in multiple roles and positions, and how can we dance between those and really use the power we have in these different positions to make more holistic change.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think just very briefly recognizing that there are these sort of global movements also to prevent that sort of international solidarity. I think in particular, there's been a movement online called ADOS, which is American Descendants of Slavery, which is specifically pitting Black Americans against non-Black Americans, both in an immigration context and you know, reparations, all of those things are sort of wrapped up, and it makes it even more difficult to form those coalitions. And it's wrapped up in you know, wild internet misinformation and in general the sort of like severing of international solidarity that you mentioned, Camille. That there's a huge history in you know, Black American in a large sense, like Black people who live in America who are organizing. You know, there's been such powerful solidarity in the past. And as life gets more difficult, it's so easy to get more and more insular, particularly as US empire begins to crumble. And, you know, you get very fixated on the crumbling of the US empire. We saw that in Trump. I saw that myself as someone who had been previously involved in, you know, Palestine solidarity movements and other sort of like liberation movements in solidarity with folks. I found myself narrowing my vision so much because it just felt so intense and like there was so much to do here. And that's always going to be true, and that will increasingly be true. And, you know, agreed on linear progress not being a thing. But I think we have to step outside of that and both acknowledge those moments when there's active campaigns to disrupt that and why.
Yeah, I think that kind of speaks to Camille's point too about, you know, that political education and history. So many of us haven't gotten that, right? And, you know, Camille, you brought up Kwame Nkrumah, and, you know, he was a big Pan-Africanist, right? And what does that mean? And I think a lot of us kind of discount our ancestors' knowledge. Like you said, we think we're progressing further, but, you know, we haven't done the reading. We haven't done the assignment to see that our ancestors were like on a totally different level than we are now, you know. And Alexis, I appreciate you bringing up ADOS because it's really frightening to me as a person who is Black American and Jamaican to see how this movement is totally ahistorical, filled with misinformation, and just used to pit, you know, so many different types of Black folks against each other. And it's just silly. It's just silly. So anyways, I wanted to open it up to other folks to speak because I know we're in a time crunch.
I just want to offer a resource, and I'll put it in the chat here, and hopefully that can be shared out with the group. Ife, our friend Abu Farman, who is the director of the Shipibo Kanibo Center in New York, and works in Indigenous-led, you know, movement with the Shipibo people of the Amazon. The Peruvian Amazon. There's a piece that he wrote about the impact of the cocaine trade and the subsequent deforestation. Apparently, cocaine farming is the now leading cause of deforestation of the Amazon at present. And so this effort is aimed at, you know, working with communities there to essentially they're resisting this this effort, you know, this the deforestation and, you know, kind of destruction of their territory, which incidentally, you know, kind of is relevant clearly from like the larger perspective of global impacts on the war on drugs, but also, you know, in terms of ayahuasca tourism and, you know, the psychedelic world, you know, kind of people seeking to extract knowledge and, you know, medicine from the Amazon, this is an opportunity. There's a fundraiser. So I'd love to share that out with folks who are attending, who may want to read the piece, learn more about it, and, contribute to Indigenous-led efforts to protect their land, right? So.
Thank you, Diana. Yeah, I think the Constellations team has shared the GoFundMe and the article. So folks, please check that out, donate and share if you can. I wanted to also open it up to Rebecca. Did you want to add on about this question in terms of like the global North-South divide?
One thing that comes to my mind, I think that it's important that people here today talked about ayahuasca. Like I mentioned before, I'm part of the Plant Medicine Healing Alliance, and they are considering like indigenous voices and excluded peyote when we are talking about decriminalization, like for group use and ritual use here. But I often don't see people talking a lot about ayahuasca, probably because the people are not here to speak up. But that's something that bothers me. I do know that there are people growing in an ethical way, and I even read about studies about different like religious communities that they are working on protecting the natural plants and ecosystem. But that's not true for all kinds of situations. I also have read about even like people working, like not working, but being enslaved to produce ayahuasca to be exported. So I've seen different types of situations too. And one thing that comes to my mind is when we are thinking about the criminalized nature, also to consider like might not be our nature, right, where we are living, but we might be decriminalizing the nature of all the people and ecosystems of all the people, and might not even know what's going on. So we might be going to a ritual and doing some spiritual work and healing work. It might be from maybe a plant that was produced by people that were in a horrible situation, in an enslaved situation. So that's my thought.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for raising that point. Thinking about how do these medicines get to us, right? Through the drug trade, and it's something that prohibition makes worse. And how do we unpack that? I know we have about 3 minutes left in our session. I wanted to try to squeeze one more question from the audience in. And maybe we could do a quick like popcorn. I wanted to come to Dr. Paula Cubillo's question. How do the panelists perceive the role big companies that are approaching the use of psychedelics with the more pharmaceutical approach should play in prioritizing the interests of indigenous communities that have used these substances for centuries? I don't know if it's kind of hard to give a quick answer to that one, but if any of you guys want to take a stab, I welcome it.
I would say land back. They should have designated land that Indigenous peoples can grow their medicine on, access their medicine, and hopefully also have at least a portion of profits going back to not only sustain those communities. I think that's one strategy, but definitely not the only thing. I think they should do a lot.
Yes, I love that you said land back, because I think, like I said earlier, it's so easy for companies to pay lip service or to like tokenize folks by just like hiring us or adding us to our board. It's like, no, like you need to give up the resources first and foremost. Other folks? All right. Well, if no one else wants to take a stab, that's totally fine. I know this is a big question. We don't have a lot of time. I want to just thank each and every one of you for this like really thoughtful, fruitful conversation. I feel like so hopeful and also just activated by, you know, everyone's knowledge that y'all shared here. And I know it's kind of weird to be feeling hopeful, but I think hope is a powerful thing, and it's a thing that we need to kind of hold on to, especially in moments like these. So I thank you guys so much, and I also want to extend my thanks to the Harm Reduction International team for welcoming us and helping us put this on. So thank you guys so much.